One of the topics that seems to be coming up a lot for me lately is the idea of who we are. Are we just a collection of memories that determines our personality? Is there something more innate to the flow of our nerves and the way the chemicals work in our brain? Is there something deeper past that, either our hearts or our souls or whatever you want to call it? In other words, who and what we are. Something we still don't know to this day in real life, and something that fiction likes to examine a lot. I feel like this topic keeps coming up because even as I watch Voyager, I happen to come across an episode which is all about, really, when you come down to it, the idea of what makes us us and what's different between us and them. Now, I want to get this out of the way pretty much right here at the beginning because when I was originally watching this episode, I was keeping note of all the things that were stupid or didn't make sense. I'm just going to put it that way. Just going to be blunt. The thing is, Brandon Braga is a very interesting writer. I've said before that he's kind of a weird thing, and when he does collaborative works, he does decent stuff, and when he does solo stuff, now he did some good episodes over on TNG. He really did. That's probably what really got him noticed. And he's really good at the type of mind game episode which he works on every now and again. And by that I mean most of his notable episodes are mind game episodes, this one included. Most people would refer to them as high concept, but the problem is the term high concept is actually a lot more generic than you'd think. Just trust me on this. So the point I'm trying to get across here is that Braga, I feel it's such a shame because I know I've talked about this before, but I wish he had been shorn up more as a writer, that he'd been taken care of and really gotten a chance to work with other people rather than being told to crank out scripts, because his episodes don't actually make a lot of sense. When you actually think about them logically, it's like, no, that doesn't work that way. And I'm not even talking about the mind game aspect itself, just the things that have to happen because the script needs them to happen, not because they make any level of sense. But I'm not here to nitpick these episodes. I'm here to talk about them. So I don't really want to go into that too much. Not really. I just wanted to mention it because this is a weird episode. We had really, really atrocious, culminating in the apocalypse that was Threshold. And then we had really, really, really good. And then we had just kind of boring. And now we have interesting. And that's what, in this episode, that's what, whatever this episode's called. I can't remember the name. That's what this episode is. It's interesting. It's not good. It's not bad. It's not boring. It's just unique in its own way. Let me go ahead and talk about this a little bit. Because, like I said, I really wanted to get this right out of the way off the bat. His idea was to really use a unique form of constant directorial shots between two stories that were happening side by side simultaneously in a way that would make it look like it was one story. And as the episode went on, it would become more and more obvious it was two different Voyagers, right? Now, I gotta be blunt, I kind of wish he'd been able to go with his original story idea, because that actually sounds really awesome to me. Imagine if the whole structure of the episode had been different, and instead, we see a few scenes from Voyager A, and then we ship over to Voyager B to see a few scenes, and they look congruent, but as the two branch off, as they become more and more different from each other, now that they are in fact different in unique Voyagers, the events between the two become more and more distinct, and it starts to get weirder as we go back and forth between them. You see where we're going with this? So I just think that would have been a lot more interesting than this. But that being said, one of the things they do really well is, and this is so weird, is the teaser. I talk about the teasers extensively in Voyager. I intend to talk about them in TNG and Deep Space Nine too, because they use the teaser format in both of those shows as well. But what they do here is fascinating because I wrote down the time. Hang on. It is a 7-minute, 9-second teaser. 7 minutes before a commercial break. Before, not even a commercial break, before the title credits roll. That's unheard of. It's one of the longest teasers in Voyager. It's one of the longest teasers in Star Trek, actually. And yet they actually do quite a lot with it. And that's the interesting part. It starts off low And well, okay, it starts off dumb. I'm actually just going to say that, and I have to comment on this. I have to. I just want to get it out there. I know that this is going to sound weird, but I've actually been around many pregnant women in my life. Most of them have been close friends and/or family. One of the things that has always just kind of gotten on my nerves, and I know this is a pet peeve because it's a pet peeve, not an actual peeve, and you know the difference, and I don't feel like defining it again. But it's a pet peeve that in television and movies, they portray women who are pregnant as 12 seconds from giving birth. You know, if you see a woman who is intended to be pregnant, she is pregnant. Oh, pakung, pakung, pakung. And that has always just kind of rubbed me the wrong way. But another thing that's always rubbed me the wrong way is the birth scene in television. And the problem is there really are only a few options of what you can do for a birth scene in television. There have been a few shows and a few movies who have tried to portray birth realistically. Most of those attempts have failed, and I mean failed as in, you know, in terms of entertainment value, because realistic birth is not a pleasant thing to experience. You know, I'm sorry, it isn't. Giving birth is an incredibly brutal, I guess is the word I'm going for, thing to go through. Sorry, but it is. So you have to romanticize it. Well, you don't have to, but in general, it is accepted to romanticize it. But there's only so many things you can do with that. You can have birth in unusual circumstances. Okay, you can have birth in, you know, where there's complications. You can have birth where everything is, you know, being unusually scripted. I know these are very vague definitions, but that's the point. There's only so many things you can do with a birth scene, right? Now, on the one hand, I like that they had very few actual scenes of the birth here in this episode. On the other hand, every one of them was your classic grade, you know, type A, straight from the textbook, I'm giving birth and I'm yelling at people. And that's it. And I wish they had almost skipped those entirely, or at least done something else with them, like have the birth going on over here and the doctor's rushing over here to do something. So she's over there and we hear her wailing off in the distance, or, you know, we see her in the corner of the screen, but we don't have to focus on her face and do the thing. It was just tiresome. That being said, I like what they did, because Wildman goes to give birth, and we see in the doctor's office and the people on the bridge. This is a wonderful scene. The directing on this episode was magnificent. And I'm going to comment more on the directing later. They're pacing the bridge. I've said before, if you're going to have no music in a scene, do it deliberately. Do it with purpose. Do it to emphasize the scene or the tone or something. Do it with reason. This is a great example of that. No music during the scene on the bridge. We're still in the teaser, by the way. No music, there's not anything stressful, there's not anything tense, it's just awkward silence, and I love it, because that's exactly what it should be, because a birth on a ship is kind of a big deal. Even back in the Alpha Quadrant, that'd be a big deal. Even here in real life, that's a big deal. So having the first birth on Voyager out there, yeah, I'm sure everyone on the ship cared to some extent or another. With exceptions, of course. And everyone on the bridge definitely would care. They're just like, okay, yeah, gosh. And watching Janeway pace the bridge in that awkward silence was awesome, and I loved it. And then finally, it's Tom who actually breaks the silence, because he can't take it anymore, and he just starts chatting. And they start up this light little conversation about it. You know, just kind of chatting about birth giving and the whole way it works. And then they notice that they're entering Vidian prime territory, basically. They are approaching a core Vidian area. Now, I have to comment on this, but you have to give your viewers credit. They are going to be using their brains to some extent or another on the first viewing or the second or the 15th. I'm sorry, but I know nobody personally, which is only 5 people who have watched this show, who watched this episode, which starts off, we're still in the teaser, and is all about, it's really lighthearted, it's light in tone, they're giving birth, there's going to be a baby, Vidians. I probably don't even have to finish my sentence, but you could probably think of what all of us were automatically assuming based on the approach, based on the tone, based on the subject material, and the presentation thereof. I'd just like to go out of my way of saying that was kind of a risky thing to do. It's not something I would have done. Whether or not it succeeds is kind of up to the individual, but it was definitely something that was very unusual. to have that tonality shift there. Maybe this is me reading too much into it, but you can't do something like that and not think about it. And then the teaser ends. 7 minutes. Well, no, okay. Then out of nowhere, they start having. They go to hide in a plasma drift, and they start having antimatter problems. And then proton bursts start beating the crap out of the ship, and people are damaged, and we're having all this problem. And now we're at problem during birth, or complications during birth situation. And then teaser ends finally. 7 minutes, 9 seconds. Holy moly! I need some water after that teaser. Whew. So, as usual, I tend to put my changes section kind of in the episode. Mine is going to go right here, because the presentation and execution of what I'm going to call the mystery up to this point has actually been pretty awesome. It's going to be presented really poorly because the writers and or producers assume that you, the viewer, are an idiot and are not using your brain. And they're pretty much going to say it flat out. They all but say, there's another Voyager hitting us with proton bursts. I believe an exact quote is, it seems to be, the bursts are coming from within the ship and seem to be coming from thin air. Really? Right. Yeah, so it was really just, it was a disservice. I feel like more could have been done and more should have been done in order to emphasize the mystery of what's going on. And so smooth out that dialogue, have the ship, which is getting the crap hammered out of it, by the way. They are just barely making it. Hogan gets brutally. Oh, by the way, good job on having Hogan back. I always like seeing recurring characters like that. So Hogan's there, and he's terribly damaged, and the baby is having issues, and then Harry Kim dies. Now, okay, I'd like to point on this for a second. I wish this had been done for more creative reasons, but it hadn't. I'll tell you flat out, they killed Kim, and they had Kes go into the under purely to have less characters to focus on. That was the reason for doing it. That's from word of mouth. It is unfortunate because I actually probably would keep Kim dying in it, as weird as that sounds. Because at that point you're just like, okay, what the hell? And again, this is a Star Trek show, so we're assuming there's going to be a reset button that's going to be hammered as hard as possible at the end of the episode. And as we see, that kind of is true. Actually, it's more true than I want to go into right now. I'll talk about that later. But it at least catches your attention. This whole time, the ship's getting hammered out of nowhere. We don't know what's going on. Maybe it's some Sunuvizian superweapon. The baby's having trouble. Kim dies trying to rescue trying to seal the breach. Taurus barely gets out. Kes is running after them with the medical supplies and then vanishes. And that's the point where we just start going, huh. Because at this point it's like, okay, we're probably thinking alternate reality, dimensional travel, something like that. But either way, it's just kind of a, huh. And I like this. Taurus then throws the conduit through, which is actually a nice touch, admittedly. And then there's a scene I have to comment on, because the woman who played Ensign Wildman does a phenomenal job of portraying a woman whose baby has just died. That's a horrible sentence to say, but it is true, because it would be so easy to do that kind of scene wrong. To go over the top and completely melodramatically, or to portray yourself as slightly angsty or otherwise antagonized, something kind of like someone would act if they got the wrong meal or there was a fly in their soup. No. Her baby died, and she does a great job of getting across that scene. Her and Picardo both just nail how horrible that is, and they do an insanely good job of that. So I wanted to give props for that. Also, yes, for those of you who are fans of the series, who have seen the series before, that is Naomi Wildman finally being born in season 2, episode 20 or whatever we're at here. I suppose I could look. I'm sorry. Let's look. Sorry for the click. There we go. Deadlock. The name of this episode is Deadlock. And it is episode 21. So, I mentioned I was going to comment on the direction again, and I really want to comment on it here. Throughout this whole section I'm talking about is probably the highlight of the episode, because there's a lot going on. Ensign Kim is trying to repair this. There's inactivity on the bridge as they're trying to figure out what the hell's going on. In the engineering, they're trying to fix this thing. In the med bay, in the sick bay, they're trying to deliver the baby while dealing with casualties. All this stuff is going on, but the directing is incredibly smooth. Everything just flows from one to the next to the next to the next. I'm going to define flow in one of my Final Fantasy when I'm doing the marathon later this week. But I want to go ahead and define it here for those of you who are not going to be watching it because I've used that term a lot. I want to define it. It's the difference between boring and well paced is a degree of intelligent variance. I've talked about this before a little bit. The idea is basically to equal out to zero, but not do so in a static pattern. Because if you do literally just this, always up to 2, always down to -2, always up to 2, always down to -2, it's repetitive. It might be interesting at first, but then it gets dull. If you do this, or this, or this, it's dull because nothing's changing. Even though, and I want to stress this is a matter of tonality, not events. If everything happening is always happening quickly and actively, you don't really have a sense for it. Everything's happening all slowly and peacefully, you don't really have a sense for it after a while. You see where I'm going with this? Flow is about finding a good balance between high highs, low lows, and everything in between, all evening out here, doing this kind of thing. This is flow. And they do a great job. Wonderful directing in this episode. Where is it? So, and then we reach the part of the episode. It's kind of a shame because I actually don't have that many notes about this episode. Like I said, it's just interesting because then we have all up to this point. I'm really with it. I'm genuinely enjoying it. Other than them treating me like an idiot, I am totally down with it. Yes, this is awesome. And then it gets this scene where they think they've finally got things locked down, and it's like, okay, in standard Star Trek, that would be the end of Act 1 for all intents and purposes. And Act 2 almost always begins with usually a technobabble, but an explanation of what's going on and method towards resolution, which will always fail, which will then be fixed in Act 3. There is a bit of a pattern to Star Trek. But instead of that, what happens is things get worse. The bursts start coming again, the magnetic polarization fails, the bridge is on fire, and Janeway is on the verge of actually sacrificing herself to try and save it. Finally is convinced to leave. She gets up and she looks around, and for a moment she sees the crew walking around her bridge as though nothing's unusual. And Janeway there is looking at her. And then we cut to that Janeway looking at Ghost Janeway running off the bridge. And all of a sudden we're on a bridge which is totally normal. And we hear that the berth has gone just fine, and we're getting all of our power back through the proton bursts. If it wasn't for the treating of us as an idiot in the first act, that would be almost a flawless execution of a kind of a moment. Because it's not a twist so much as it is, like I said, interesting. It gets you thinking. It gets your attention. It's like, oh, okay, And I liked it, and it was really well done. And then the episode kind of goes downhill. I only have like 5 more comments on the entire rest of the episode, but I want to mention a few of them because some of them do deserve some serious discussion. First and foremost, one of the things I dislike in Voyager, especially, Star Trek in general does this. A lot of older television and even some more recent television does this. I hate it when someone walks to me and tells me everything that's going on. I know that sounds weird, but I like figuring out things for myself. I don't mind you leaving hints. I don't mind you saying, blah, 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 blah. And I'm not talking about going to the further extreme, like that movie whose name I can't even think of all of a sudden. Inception. You know how the end of Inception, they left the top spinning, and they intentionally never explained that, never will? That, in my opinion, is actually going too far to the other extreme of leaving it completely up to the viewer. It can be done with good effect on certain occasions. But what I like is something in the middle of between. I don't like being told, and then this happened, and then that also happened. And, I feel like it was done for padding in this episode's sake, too, which is really weird, because they had so much going on. I shouldn't say it's weird. It's actually perfectly understandable. They were having a lot of budgetary issues with this episode because they really, really spent a lot of money on investigations, which was the previous episode, because they had to pay 2 guest stars, which is more expensive than it sounds. And in this episode, where they had to do a lot of shots with damaging the bridge, which was a lot of work on that, they had to do a lot of effects shots, and several of the actors got, I forget the term, but it's basically increased pay for the extra duty they had to pull. Kate Mulgrew especially. I'll go ahead and comment on this now. Kate Mulgrew had to act against herself in several scenes, and she herself loved it. She said it was incredibly challenging and incredibly difficult, and she had, acting against herself, which is funny because it's something that also was mentioned by Brent Spiner over in an episode called Brothers, where he had to act against himself, acting against himself. But my point is, they put a lot of money into this episode, so they literally blew everything here, blew everything here, blew everything here, and they had like 5 or 10 minutes total in chunks throughout the episode that they literally had to pad because they couldn't do anything special with it. Now, whether that is a success or a failure is kind of up to the opinion of the individual, because that is literally the definition of being ambitious and failing. But I do have to give them credit for the fact that the other parts that they did work on were actually pretty awesome. It's just the padding is just kind of so there's a lot of padding, and that's all I'm going to talk about. I just mentioned it right there. Water. I also like the fact that ship communication was very difficult for the two, and they had to do some very strange things. Just literally a noise across all subspace in order to get their attention, and then trying to get across a signal, and then trying to get across a frequency, and then they can talk just fine. And yet, this is a little closer to standard Star Trek method, because usually by the end of Act 2 they have the solution, they try it, it fails, and then Act 3 is the resolution of that. So again, they try the thing to resync the ships, it fails horribly, they've lost communication, blah 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 blah, and then we get into the scene where the Janeways are talking against each other. So pretty standard stuff there. One of the things I both like and dislike is that they spent almost no time on the trust issues. What I mean by that is it would have been very easy to make this all into, well, this could be a trick, or this could be a trap, or, something's going on with regards to us being deceived in some manner. On both sides, I might add. It would have been very easy for that to happen. Neither side actually bothered with more than about 40 seconds at most on that, and most of that was just completely dismissing the idea. I like that because that's not the focus of the episode. And doing that would have just bogged it down, kind of like the padding did earlier, I mentioned. But I dislike it because it actually makes no sense to do that. To just automatically say, no, they're right. Well, no. What they're talking about happening was ludicrous to begin with, and is extremely unlikely in the best of circumstances, and it's actually really feasible that, so close to extremely hostile territory, we are being tricked in some way. But whatever. I just wanted to comment on that there. I also want to comment on one other thing. One of the things I have preached almost about, and I hate to use that word because I hate preaching, but it's true. I keep talking about how I like continuity. It doesn't have to be string continuity. It doesn't have to be plot continuity. I like continuity in my fiction. I always have. One of the things I always felt was a missed opportunity in this episode was Harry Kim and Naomi Wildman. With the exception of the books, the fact that those two are phase variants from, and from a different reality, different cloned Voyager, whatever you want to call it, is never brought up again, never has any significance whatsoever. And I always kind of liked the idea that it kind of should have, if that makes any sense. Because one of the issues this episode doesn't, it kind of touches on but doesn't really, is what I mentioned right there at the beginning. The concept that we are different people than we are if we were different than we are. And I know that sounds kind of weird, but under these circumstances, let's say I just split into two right now. Now, this is my opinion because there is no way to prove this one way or another. And as I mentioned before, we in real life have been debating this issue for ever. But it is my opinion that as soon as these two people are made, the me and me too, we are both separate individuals. We are both completely different people. There's no existential crisis for me or me, because both of me knows that the other me is not me. They are them now. You see the difference? But this episode takes that and does kind of analyze it because, when the two Janeways are looking at each other, when we're talking about the two different ships and the people on them, Harry Kim coming over, the two doctors even, he's not even flesh and blood, and yet the same concept applies. They really look at the issue, but only kind of at a glance. And I kind of like that too, because again, that probably would have taken away from the focus of the episode. But that brings me to my real problem with this episode and why it's just interesting and not good, bad, or boring. There is no focus to this episode. It is a high concept thing, the whole splitting reality mystery thing, and then some action. And that's it. It is very well executed. It really is. It reminds me of The Cloud in many ways, although not nearly as bad as far as the concept. So it's really well executed. It's really well performed. It's very well directed. They even do a decent job with the music for once, and I don't want to talk about the music too much, but and on one of these episodes, I'm going to have to find an episode where it's really good to talk about the problem with Voyager music. But anyways, I'm getting off topic. Point being, there is no overarching, strong, cohesive theme. There is no relevance to anything. Nothing that is happening actually is significant. It's just events. And that's one of the problems with it. I felt like they could have, woven the theme in a bit more. Actually done something with it. Something along those lines. I'm sorry, pardon me a moment. Something's off here. Okay, never mind. Now, the other thing I want to comment on is there is a scene which is awesome. It's arguably even better than the one that was in Star Trek 3. The Vidians are running through the ship, and I'm sorry, I said I wouldn't comment on all the things that make no sense, but God, the Voyager crew give the most pathetic defense of a ship I've ever seen. Well, I'm sorry, I should be more accurate than this. The second most pathetic defense of a ship I've ever seen, because the most pathetic actually happened on Next Generation in an episode called Rascals. If you know that episode, you know what I mean. But regardless, it's pathetic. It's disgustingly pathetic. I just had to comment on it. But anyway, so Vidians on the ship, they come to the... And that is... I totally forgive that because of this scene. They get up there, Janeway's there, and she stands, and she's just kind of smiling. And there's just this wonderful radiance about her as she's like, hello, welcome to Voyager. I'm Captain Catherine Janeway. And then they see the self-destruct thing, and then they're blown to hell. I love that scene. Oh my God, that scene was like worth the entire rest of the episode by itself. One of the things... Well, okay, I want to say something brief, and then I want to do my final comment for the episode. One of the things that I liked was Janeway has a quote that she gives to the other Harry, aka the Harry that they're now stuck with, which is, and I quote, "We're Starfleet officers. Weird is part of the job." And I liked that because not only is that extremely true, but it's also kind of indicative of her own mindset on the matter. It also comes right after a coda of her talking with Tuvok about, and again, just kind of glancing over the issue of me versus me that I was just talking about earlier. But the final thing I really want to talk about is why, is to give you, I know, you want me to shut up. I can just hear you saying it. Arsh, shut up about continuity. I want to give you a direct example of why continuity and the lack of it pisses me off. A total lack of it. This episode, the ship that survives of the two Voyagers is the one that was damaged so badly it was debatable as to whether or not it would be livable. It was the one they had to retreat to engineering in order to function. It was the one which had a bajillion hull fractures and rips in the ship, and their shields were down and their deflectors were down and everything was broken. That's the ship that survives, the one that's in pieces, okay? I'm with that. The next episode is Innocence, where the ship is fine, and they also have... well, they're also going to lose a shuttle. I think they actually do recover it on that one. But anyways, the point is, the next episode is Innocence, where the ship is fine. You see the problem with this? Back on TNG, even on Deep Space Nine when that happened, it wasn't that big of a deal. Because it could be argued in setting that, okay, they can go to a space dock and get repairs, or they could get repairs brought to them, or they could do whatever. They had infrastructure. They had backing. They had resources. What does Voyager have? Other than an infinite supply of photon torpedoes and shuttles. Inside joke for those of you who are fans of Voyager. And so it bothers me when they so flagrantly throw continuity out the window, because it just makes me kind of go, what? Why? I'm gonna explain this as best as I can. This is just my opinion, but really the core reason it bothers me so much is it makes it feel like it's insignificant. Now, too much continuity can also be a bad thing. I've talked about this before. But when you do a whole episode about your ship, and it's terrible, and it's doomed, and all this horrible stuff is happening, and the next episode, everything fine, and nothing ever mattered ever, why did the events of the previous episode matter? Why did the events of this episode matter? If there's no connectivity, what's the point? It's just a bunch of short stories that have nothing to do with each other. Now, that is purely my opinion, and I freely admit that. That's not a definitive thing. But that's kind of where I look at it. And especially with a show that has a strong background for a setting and for string continuity or setting continuity, to do that so flagrantly is just really. I'm gonna go ahead and let it rest. I swear. Until we get to another. I'm going to go really far out of my way to not talk about continuity until we get to the episode Equinox. And then we're going to speechify because I have a lot to say about Equinox. But for now, I'm going to go ahead and hit stop on my recorder. And I will see you later.